Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Jeff Chusid. I'm an associate professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning, and I'm pleased to bring you today this program about the architect Joseph Allen Stein, whose work I've been studying for over a decade, and whose archive the family has just donated to the Cornell University Library. We will start the program with a talk by Stein's son, David, about his father's life and work. I will then offer some reflections on the context of Stein's work and what we can glean from studying his life and career. And we will conclude the formal presentation with comments by Professor Emerita Mary Woods. David Stein is an urban and regional planner who was born in the U.S. and grew up in India. His work has included projects and employment in the U.S., India, and Israel. He holds a BA in sociology and a Master of City Planning from the University of California at Berkeley. Professionally, he has worked at both the municipal and regional levels, having been, among other positions, director of the transportation program at the New England Regional Commission in the 1970s, a transportation planner and later manager at the Southern California Association of Governments, the planning director for the Northern Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, and the executive director of Nationsport, an industry association serving the Port of New York and New Jersey. He also worked on the preparation of the National Capital Regional Plan for New Delhi, and together with his wife, the landscape architect Achva Benzenberg Stein, the Greenbelt Development Plan for the community of Oroville in India, and a town plan for the community of Mateo on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Our second speaker, or third after me, will be Mary Woods, the author of seminal works about architectural education and practice and film photography and the built environment, including Women Architects in India, Histories of Practice in Mumbai and Delhi, Beyond the Architect's Eye, Photographs of the American Built Environment, and From Craft to Profession, Practice of Architecture in 19th Century America. Mary was the inaugural Michael McCarthy Professor of Architectural Theory and received the Tau Sigma Delta Silver Medal for Distinguished Scholarship in 2018. Current projects include a documentary film on single-screen cinemas in India with director Vani Subramanian, an exhibition and catalog on Mumbai's architecture of the night with photographer Chiradeep Chaudhary, and a history of post-industrial ruins and urban renewal in New York City and Mumbai. So with that, I'd like to welcome David Stein.
Thank you, Jeff, and it's a treat to be here. Thank you very much. What to say? I find it both curious and rather difficult to talk about my father as an architect when I am not one myself. I'm an urban planner. I would admit that I have lived amongst architects and design professionals or their children for most of my life and count myself quite friendly with a number of them. So yes, I do understand something about architecture, but that's on a very personal level, not as a designer. I grew up in a very special world in which both aesthetics and social concerns counted heavily in the thinking of those in my family's circle of friends. And that, of course, influenced my own development and thought. The world in which I grew up was a very broad one, and I am deeply grateful for this special upbringing that has so greatly influenced my own personal development and hence my own outlook. Now to the point. Who was Joseph Allen Stein? He came from a very modest background. His parents ran a store in Omaha, Nebraska, and were in many senses quite ordinary people. Immigrants or children of immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Russia and Romania. Yet by the age of 12, Joe had made two major life commitments. He would be an architect and he would be an agnostic. Graduating from high school at 16, he began college at the University of Nebraska, but soon transferred. Oops, I'm missing slides and I don't quite know how to. That's Joe Stein, who I remember, and this is when he was a college student. He worked with Carl Millis, the well-known sculptor out of Cranbrook. He began college at the University of Nebraska, but soon transferred to the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, where there was an excellent school of architecture. He soon showed his talent and went on from there to win prizes and make close connections with his teachers. His strongest memories of this time were of his post-MA studies at Cranbrook, where he studied under both Eliel Saarinen and Carl Millis, the noted Swedish sculptor. And all of his life, he remembered them with both respect for their outsized talent and the influences they had on his own development. And this is a slide of the meeting of the waters in St. Louis, made by Carl Millis. My father actually was a model for one of the statues, I believe. I've never seen it personally, but I'm told that he was there. After a brief stint in France at the École des Beaux-Arts in Fontainebleau, he returned to the U.S. and started working in New York for the office of Élie Jacques Kahn, then one of the most prestigious firms in the city. His work included designing a housing project on Welfare Island, now called Roosevelt Island, but his strongest memory was of the status of a junior architect. This was during the Depression, and as was the norm for newly graduated architects, he worked for free, supported by his parents, and subsisted largely on bananas and peanut butter. One day, a client came into the office to see Mr. Kahn, who was busy at the time, and so suggested that the client talk instead to the project manager, Joe Stein. The client was insulted and loudly said, "I am paying you $50,000 for this project, and all I get is to talk to Stein." At which point, my father, who hadn't received even a nickel of car fare, quit. Meanwhile, he had also met and married my mother, and they decided to take up an offer that had been made by Richard Neutra on a visit to the office, noting that Neutra had said that there would be work for him in the office if he moved to Los Angeles. So my parents, thinking that this was a serious offer, moved to LA only to discover that there was no job. Although fortunately one did materialize shortly afterward, and he went to work there in Neutra's office. In Neutra's office, he also met Gregory Ain, with whom he became a close friend and later, briefly, a partner. But many years later, when at the request of Raymond Neutra, I interviewed my father about working in Neutra's office, what it was like, his only comment was to say, Mrs. Neutra was the best thing about the office and wouldn't say another word. Neutra also paid miserable wages, and soon he left his $25 a week job there for working at the Los Angeles Housing Authority at triple the pay. He began a partnership with Gregory Ain, although that too was short-lived, noting that we spent more time solving the world's problems than doing architecture. At the end of his partnership with Ain, my parents moved to San Francisco. My father worked briefly in the office of Harvey Clark before being drafted into working as a designer in Marin Ship, a naval shipyard managed by the Kaiser and Bechtel firms during the Second World War. At the end of the war, he started his own practice in San Francisco, working in partnership with John Funk, whom he admired for his detailing, and with the landscape architect Garrett Ekbo and Bob Royston, who were both to be lifelong friends, and for one of whom, Royston, he designed a home that was a modified mirror image of the home he had designed for his own family in Mill Valley, California. I might mention that my wife was lucky enough to also study under both Garrett Ekbo and Bob Royston when she was a student at Berkeley. His strongest interest had always been in low-cost housing. For him, it was essential that the homes of ordinary people offer the same positive experiences as those of the more fortunate. At this point, I should share a favorite quotation of his from his teacher at Cranbrook, the great Finnish-American architect Eliel Saarinen, which is, to discern those principles which are inherent in the nature of things from time immemorial and are valid under any circumstances. Why am I focusing on these seemingly irrelevant aspects? Because he strongly believed that architecture has a powerful influence on how people live and relate to the world around them. An architect is someone who creates environments in which others live and work and play, and the quality of their experiences is strongly influenced by the quality of the environment. Ooh, excuse me. My phone has suddenly decided to announce itself. And if it is a welcoming or visually stimulating environment, it offers opportunities for growth and, above all, in his phrasing, if it is inviting. That was his favorite word about what architecture should do, be inviting. He believed that our environment should be pleasing, stimulating, and offer opportunities for positive reflection. He spoke frequently of the ugliness of the modern city with its pressures of crowding, traffic, and in particular, the terrible conditions under which the less fortunate were condemned by societies that failed to provide decent environments. For him, appropriate architecture meant attention to the history, to the existing context, to the hopes for the future, and the techniques and building materials available. He approached architecture with a very clear sense of its strengths and limitations and felt it his duty to show that the works of man, however glorious and impressive, had to fit within a much broader context, one determined by a full understanding of the history, the culture, and the physical environment that held the building under design. It was in San Francisco in the early 40s that a group of younger architects, landscape architects, and planners began to publicly address the necessity of housing for ordinary people as a fundamental public responsibility. This group included John Funk, Garrett Ekbo, Robert Royston, Lawrence Halprin, Francis Vielich, Vernon DeMars, Corwin Mosine, Jerry Knight Scott, Jack Kent, and Walter Landor and Bill Worcester, among others, and became known as Telesis. There is a history of Telesis that one can look up. It was actually quite an interesting group of people. The word Telesis was defined as, quote, progress intelligently planned. Think about the future that you're creating. By which it was meant that even the best design must be set within its social and environmental contexts. This came as a reaction to the Depression era and the conditions of the working people in America, both in factories and on farms. Especially migrant labor had been living under, and on the farms where migrant labor had been living. Together, the organizers made a significant contribution to the emergence of the post-war environmental design culture in the Bay Area. And now we will go to the next slide. This was the home that my father designed for his own family in Mill Valley, California. In the center, you can see faintly my dog, the great collie Simba. It was a very simple house, and you can see more in the exhibit. This sense of the importance of the physical and social environments led him and many of his friends to teach at the California Labor School, an after-hours university sponsored by the International Longshore and Warehouse Union under Harry Bridges, the powerful leader of a militant organization. For this, my father was branded a communist by the FBI, even though he was never a member of the party. Our phone was tapped, his attendance at meetings was noted, and it was even claimed that he had a membership card in the party. All this in documents we found from the FBI when we searched. Eventually, with the outbreak of the Korean War, my parents felt that the situation had become intolerable, and they decided to leave the United States. In the summer of 1950, we moved to Mexico City, where my father hoped that there would be better opportunities to focus his attention on housing. Although he made a number of important friends, and I have a strong visual memory of a visit to the then still under construction of the home of Luis Barragan, with its wonderful interior waterfall, Mexican law required a 3-year residence before it would offer a work permit, and this was unfortunately beyond our means. So in January of 1951, we embarked on a small ship for Genoa in Italy, where we were met by old friends from the Bay Area who had also left the United States under similar circumstances. We moved around a bit in Europe, from Genoa to Milano, to Lugano and Geneva in Switzerland, and then to the Alpine resort of an Alpine resort in France. During this time, he had met a newspaper correspondent who wrote for various newspapers, including a paper from Calcutta. And on a visit to the coincidentally named Gunther Stein, he found an advertisement for a professor of architecture at the Bengal Engineering College in Calcutta, applied for it, and on the recommendation of Richard Neutra, was offered the job. We sailed from Southampton in southern England in late September, arriving in Bombay, now Mumbai, as they say, on October 19th. This date is etched in my mind because it turned out to be the day of Diwali, and we were treated to the most magnificent welcome imaginable as we rode the train from Bombay to Calcutta that night, in which every home in every village was lit up with rows of little oil lamps lined up along windowsills and entryways, and by a most wonderful coincidence, using Diwali as the marker, it is exactly now 70 years since the Steins landed in India. The next 3 years were spent in Calcutta, where he was the head of the Department of Architecture. It was, in many ways, a most positive experience, and the students were both talented and eager. One of their regular exercises on vacationing was to travel to historic sites in various parts of India to make measured drawings of the great temples and palaces found throughout the country. He also entertained a number of distinguished visitors, including Bucky Fuller, who supervised students in the building of a geodesic dome out of bamboo. Another visitor was the Israeli architect Aryeh Sharon, who was then working in Burma and who stopped in Calcutta on his way home. Joe designed 2 low-cost houses, one rural and one urban, for an exhibit in New Delhi in the winter of 1954 and 1955. These houses attracted the attention of Prime Minister Nehru and led, not long after, to a commission to design one of the 3 new steel towns being built, this one at Durgapur in West Bengal. This new town, located in the Damodar Valley, where a massive TVA-style flood control project was being built, was also underway. Initially housed about 50,000 persons in the designs he produced, and today has grown to more than 5 times that size. Durgapur proved to be a very mixed experience. Doing a large-scale development under contract to the government of India offered a major scope for his ideas of neighborhood, cost, quality of design, and in particular, adaptation to climate and culture. He studied the lifestyles of people who might be typical of the residents of Durgapur and sought, within the constraints of the budget, to provide homes that were open, airy, secure, and comfortable, where possible, also offered the possibility of expansion, knowing that the initial construction would never be large enough for families as they grew. This job lasted for over 3 years and also allowed him the opportunity to meet many of the leading figures in the art and architecture worlds of India. Among his favorites was Sundari Sridharani, an ambitious widow and recent refugee from what is now Pakistan, who was determined to build a school of the arts. This was to become the Triveni Kala Sangam, which remained always his favorite project. It is one of 3 major cultural centers he designed in Delhi, the other 2 being the India International Center and the India Habitat Center. This is the Triveni Kala Sangam, an art school, still operated, and it is still under the direction of the son and daughter of the original founder, and both of whom happen to be my friends even to this day. So we have a nice relationship as well with clients and former clients. And that's some 60 years since that building was put up. Another issue that deeply concerned my father was the degradation of the environment, both physical and human. India's cities are fascinating places, but the living conditions for a very large proportion of this population, perhaps even the majority, are, to use a simple word, terrible. Unfortunately, there was little in the way of public investment in housing except for government employees, and so there was little that my father could do in this field despite his initial desire to do that kind of work in India. As an alternative, he began to focus on the impacts of development in the mountains, the foothills of the Himalayas. And I would mention that in India, a foothill is anything less than 15,000 feet high. He was invited, together with B.V. Doshi, to develop a plan for the resort of Gulmarg in Kashmir, and also made a number of visits to both Nepal and Bhutan. Here he saw the impacts of careless road building, the poor siting of dams, deforestation, which was often done to supply tourists with campfire material, and population increases. Realizing that the continuation of these conditions could lead to catastrophic denuding, landslides, and severe downstream flooding, he brought together a small group of concerned people who, using grants from the German and Swiss governments, convened an international conference on mountain environment development. This resulted in the creation of the UN Development Program-sponsored International Center for the Integrated Mountain Development, which is now in Kathmandu, Nepal. The members of this center are Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar, Nepal, and Pakistan. These nations are the sources and consumers of water from the Himalaya and the Hindu Kush mountains, including among them nearly half the world's population. It also served as the model for a similar institution for the Andean nations. Joe studied issues of appropriate technology, deeply concerned that more advanced technologies were beyond the skills and resources of a large part of the world. He was also a serious reader of philosophy, finding the writings of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin especially moving. Another role he took on was serving as architectural and sustainable development advisor for the King of Bhutan, a small Himalayan country that has the distinction of being the only carbon-neutral nation in the world, and which measures its progress by an index of gross national happiness. This role led to designs for hotels and suggestions for ways to incorporate traditional building techniques into newer housing. So far, I haven't spoken about his designs with any specificity. There are a number of well-known structures, most in New Delhi and its surroundings, as well as in Mumbai, Hyderabad, Kashmir, and of course, the San Francisco Bay Area. He also designed housing for the initial 50,000 residents of Durgapur, for 2 sectors for the steel town in Bhilai, and several of these buildings have become, shall we say, iconic. The India International Center, the India Habitat Center, and the Triveni Kala Sangam all occupy important places in the social and cultural life of New Delhi. His factories for Escorts Limited demonstrated his intense interest in lightweight, large-span roofing structures. These ones were built at a fraction of the cost of the standard factories at the time. In mentioning factories, I should point out that he was greatly concerned with both the physical and the aesthetic environments of work, believing strongly that the underlying Bauhaus aesthetic, which deemed working people had the same rights to decent environments as those who normally could employ architects. And here I have a picture. This is one of his factories for Escorts. They produced for a number of years something called the Rajdoot motorcycle there. And it was marvelous that you could walk in there, and as you can see what I have written, you could carry on a conversation in a normal tone of voice while the machines were working in that factory building. It was unair conditioned, and it was comfortable to work in, even in the heat of Delhi in May. And another building that he did, which I very much loved, is the International Trade Center in Delhi, which unfortunately was destroyed along with another building by the architect Raj Rewal in a recent fit of, shall we say, anti-modernism that took over India during the early years of Prime Minister Modi. His notebooks are full of ideas not only for roofing systems, but also for expandable homes. These homes are intended for young couples and designed to make easy enlargements as the family and its income grew over time. His last two major buildings were demonstrations of models to advance his major concerns with building in the developing world. The India Habitat Center in New Delhi developed some of his ideas on compact development in cities, and was intended also to serve as a model for a new form of higher density housing. The second is the Sher-e-Kashmir International Conference Center in Srinagar, which was his statement on a way to accommodate the inevitable development of tourism in the Himalayas while still preserving the environment and respecting local culture. And here you can see, this is the Kashmir Conference Center. It's located on the edge of Dal Lake, which is one of the most beautiful sites in the world, and reflects also the fact that there are a number of important Mughal gardens nearby, and so he designed a garden that would, shall we say, modestly follow in that tradition. One of the sad things is that in the recent change of governments within the Kashmir structure, this building was used as a prison for all the senior Kashmiri politicians, which I think would have appalled my father. And here is the India Habitat Center in New Delhi, designed as higher density office space, but as also a model that could be used in a slightly different form as housing in a much more pleasant environment than is normally found. Unfortunately, that aspect of this building was never explored much further because there was no demand for such housing, and he wasn't able to actually put up a building of that sort. Joe was constantly sketching and writing down ideas for better designs, whether small construction details or designs for large-scale developments. He also kept a whole series of notebooks in which he wrote extensively about design and the practice of architecture, though almost none of this has yet been published. As you can no doubt tell, I'm immensely proud to be the son of Joe Stein, a man who created a great deal of beauty and also promoted many important concepts. I miss our long talks, many of them held on walks in idyllic locations: Lugano in Switzerland, Srinagar in Kashmir, Paris and San Francisco, and of course Calcutta and New Delhi. We talked of almost everything, from daily events to philosophy, literature, physics, mathematics, geometry, and of course his latest projects. I learned not only some of the details of managing a practice, but also stories about the odds and ends of meeting with clients. There are, of course, many stories, but I would leave you with just one which I believe exemplifies his work more than any other. This is a story about the creation of a little park at the entry to the India International Center, a park dedicated to Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and to man's search for social justice. This is the India Habitat Center, the interior. I might also note that the roofing system was designed in such a way it admits the sun during the winter and shades during the summer. So you can actually use this outdoor space even in May in Delhi to sit outdoors and enjoy a picnic lunch at noontime. even if it's 112 outside. Shortly after the construction of the India International Center, he was asked to design the office complex for the Ford Foundation in India, which was on a site directly across the street from the Indian International Center. Doug Ensminger was then the representative of the Ford Foundation in India, and during one of their many meetings, the idea was hatched to dedicate a small area on the boundary between the two facilities and dedicate it for this purpose, that is, a monument to Gandhi and King. Both Ensminger and the then head of the India International Center agreed enthusiastically, and the plan was confirmed. For the inauguration of the Ford Foundation complex, the then president of the foundation, McGeorge Bundy, who had been a senior advisor on the Vietnam War, and the president of India, Dr. Zakir Hussain, were the guests of honor. When Bundy arrived in New Delhi, the plan for this joint dedication of the property was presented to him by Ensminger. It should be noted that Bundy had been one of the leading advisors to President Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War, and reputedly, Bundy's response was, "Gandhi is okay, but that bastard King, never." Ensminger was, quite naturally, deeply upset by this. When he reported it to my father, they quickly agreed that the two of them would then approach the president for advice. An appointment was secured, and the situation was explained to him. President Hussain simply smiled and said he would see to it that the matter was taken care of. A couple of days later, at the inauguration of the Ford Foundation building, Dr. Hussain was seated next to Mr. Bundy. The president leaned over to Bundy and said he thought it was a wonderful gesture that a monument to both Gandhi and King was to be created, and thanked the Ford Foundation for its gift of part of the land on which it was to be built. Needless to say, Bundy was unable to sustain his opposition to the project, and the monument now stands there to this day. Underneath a peepal tree, that is a ficus religiosa, that was planted by my father. And this is the India International Center, and this is the monument to King, dedicated, as I say, to man's search for social justice through nonviolence. And finally, as a personal tribute to his work, the street between the India International Center and the Ford Foundation buildings was renamed, and to this day is called Joseph Stein Lane. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that overview of Joe's work and the values and principles that were so central to his life and career. You can see more of these projects by going next door to the Bibliowicz Gallery after the talk. I would like to take a few minutes to look outwards to see how a study of the life and career of Joseph Allen Stein can help us investigate a range of cultural and political narratives that help us to form the context for his work and that give us a glimpse of the forces acting in the world of his times. Among these, Stein's role in the architecture of independence. Well, he arrived in India just 5 years after partition and the creation of the new state. And in Prime Minister Nehru's project for a modern developed country. Where was Joe in relation to other architects of the time and other built developments? The nature of Stein's projects, such as the large number of projects for NGOs, both independent and related in some way to the central government, also show the priorities of the Indian government for certain types of institutions and particular routes to economic and social development. Similarly, over his career, even just in how Stein's projects were funded, we can see India's transition away from colonialism and dependency. Initially, U.S. foundations and foreign governments were major clients of Stein's, but those forms of project funding dropped off over the years as monies from private industry and Indian entities became more important. A second interesting thread is the role of the expatriate in the colonial and post-colonial design world throughout the Global South. In India, Otto Königsberger from Germany, Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret from Switzerland, Patrick Geddes, Jane Drew, Maxwell Fry, Laurie Baker from the UK, Albert Meyer, Matthew Nowicki, Ben Polk, Christopher Benninger, and Joe Stein from the US, all brought multiple ideas about modernism in design and planning, about technology, about economic and social development to India in the 20th century. Of these, only Stein, Benninger, and Baker became long-term residents, but all had Indian architects and planners working with them who built on the networks and continued the conversation around form, the nature of design practice, and their design values and priorities. Rahul Malhotra underscored the way in which Stein and these other expatriates provided a linkage between power and practice in these countries and the particular role that they played. Another interesting thread is the importance of India during the Cold War as the world's largest democracy and the dominant entity in the non-aligned bloc. India was a focus of great attention in the 1950s and 60s by academics from across the US, MIT, Harvard, Berkeley, Cornell, and from governments hoping to get India into their economic and political sphere. Interestingly, this connects to the role of philanthropic foundations, especially Ford and Rockefeller Foundations in India. In 1951, Nehru asked Ford to set up an office in the country, and in the next decades, the foundation's largest office outside New York was the one in New Delhi. Under the direction of Doug Ensminger, who graduated with a PhD in rural development sociology from Cornell in 1939, Ford funded master plans for major cities, the construction of university buildings and research centers, and programs in health and agriculture. It is now generally understood that Ford was also a significant operation of the Central Intelligence Agency. It seems ironic, perhaps, that Joe, who left the U.S. largely because of the Red Scare, ended up being supported in at least 4 early major projects by Ford, in the end, somewhat benefiting from the Cold War that indirectly brought him to India. That's one way to look at it. But in this, Stein was like many artists, writers, and other cultural figures who had to leave the U.S. at that time, but in exile were supported by organizations or found outlets and publications that were funded by the CIA as the front line in the war for the hearts and minds of the world, showing the softer side of American culture in supposed contrast to heavy machinery and brute power of the Soviet model. It's also interesting to contemplate Joe's work and reputation in India today and what that says about changes there. The IIC, the India International Center, was meant to be a place for intellectual conversation across national, cultural, and social lines. Today, it also has become a club for the social and political elites of India. And the buildings themselves have been modified and expanded to accommodate the center's success. One might argue, without due regard for the original architecture's simplicity, elegance, and modesty. As David noted, Stein's National Trade Exhibition Hall at Pragati Maidan was demolished along with Raj Rewal's magnificent Hall of Nations from 1972 to make way for bigger, flashier event spaces. And of course, the luxury hotel at the Kashmir Conference Center turns into a prison in 2019. Changes in the political winds that helped create Stein's legacy are now blowing in other directions. Looking further back, Joe's life and work in the U.S. before he and the family left in 1950 tell us much about the political, social, and cultural changes that happened in this country following the end of World War II, especially the Red Scare and the Blacklist. which not only impacted Hollywood, but reached across all U.S. society. For one thing, over half the government employees fired during this period for alleged socialist tendencies were Jewish, and as many as 90% of school teachers who were fired for so-called subversive tendencies as well. It underscores the degree to which the Red Scares actually targeted non-Christian and non-white populations. But we can go even further back to the political tumult of 1919, the first Red Scare following the Russian Revolution, and the Palmer raids during which immigrants such as Emma Goldman, a Jewish immigrant from Russia, were among hundreds deported for their activism despite being U.S. citizens. In Omaha at that time, there was an intense political battle between socialists, and Joe's father apparently worked for a socialist mayor at the time, and a corrupt, entrenched political machine. In 1919, this fight fomented a race riot that led to the brutal lynching of a black man, Will Brown, an event that left an indelible mark in the young Stein's consciousness. We can therefore see in his life the immense impacts of social and political battles that are, alas, still playing out across America today. If we look more closely at Joe's work itself, we can explore the seemingly contradictory but surprisingly intertwined strands of his Beaux-Arts education and modernism, which is more understandable if we realize, as David pointed out, that Joe was a student during the Great Depression, and architecture was changing as much as any other aspect of American society and culture to deal with the social impacts of the economic devastation of the time. And how his version of the Bay Area's regional modernism that came out of that interrelationship served him so well in India. We can also see in Stein's work the great belief he shared with people such as his friend Bucky Fuller and the Bauhaus in the promise of technology. As David noted, Stein's factories were surprisingly humane environments for the workers because of his thoughtful and deliberate use of simple materials and techniques, even as they produced innovations in lightweight, long-span structures. And the history of what was arguably at times the largest architecture and engineering firm in India reveals remarkable changes in architectural practice and in the construction industry over Stein's 40 years in India. From the early years of his small office of 2 rooms on Asif Ali Road, where drawings had to be covered with towels to protect them from the constant dust of Delhi and the drops of sweat from the draftsmen in the heat of Delhi's summers, to the 3 floors of offices in Sundarnagar with specialized teams working on a wide range of diverse projects in an urban environment. With over 100 people at times in the firm, over the years there was, as one former employee said, a great alumni group developed of architects in India who've worked for Stein. They would go on to work not only across India, but around the world as architects and educators. He was called Baba, or father, in response to the respect that Joe showed to everyone else in the office, although they also noted he could be impatient at times, and how he would stop by every desk every day to say hello and see what was going on and to make gentle suggestions as needed. Nalini Thakur noted that Joe's office was the only one in the 1960s and 70s in which women were treated the same as men. And by the 1990s, his firm had many women with significant positions in place, including one of his last partners, Meena Mani. It's important to underscore the numerous architects and engineers who played significant roles in the work coming out of Stein's office. Obviously, what was built needed the talents of many others besides Joe to happen. And there were a number of people who worked with Joe for decades, such as P.K. Chaudhry, Pritpal Singh, P.C. Jain, and others with recognized practices of their own today, such as Amita Sinha, A.B. Lal, Sumit Ghosh, Sudhir Vora, Snehanshu Mukherjee, Avalamba et al. It is also worth mentioning that Joe's wife, Margaret, was deeply engaged in the practice, especially with interiors. Construction also changed over the decades. At the India International Center, the workers built a modern building with precast concrete elements, aluminum doors and windows, all crafted by hand. Stein would talk about having the best of all worlds, access to the new world of products and technologies available after the end of the Second World War, and the skilled traditional craftsmen that could be found virtually everywhere in India. Within just a few years, however, many of the best craftsmen had left for the Middle East and Iran, or to work on reconstruction in Europe, and Western construction models adopted in India were leading to a deterioration in the quality of the buildings. In conclusion, I want to touch on a few of his aspirations. Next to an early sketch of the India International Center, you can see this in the exhibit, Joe wrote, "Architecture is essentially a cultural statement and not simply a play of forms and structural ideas. As a cultural expression, architecture becomes something larger and more complex than building design. It becomes the manner and extent of integration of all the diverse elements which the owner, designer, and designer consider of interest and importance." Joe was also quoted as saying he wanted to make good buildings, not great ones. In other words, he derived his greatest satisfaction from making places that worked well, that helped users to do their jobs, that were efficient and economical, not necessarily ones that were obviously self-important. Or to put it another way, again quoting Stein, architecture is the picture frame, not the picture. I would argue that his architecture often achieved greatness anyway. And with that, I'd like to introduce Mary Woods.
See if I can get this off. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be back in Milstein Hall with so many cherished colleagues and to see new faces as well in the 3 years since I retired. First of all, I want to thank Jeff. It's a tremendous honor, but also pleasure to be here. It's always wonderful to be with Jeff. He's such an accomplished and generous colleague. And then to be with the Stein family, David Stein, that wonderful and heartfelt lecture, and also Akva Stein, a wonderful landscape architect in her own right. So thank you again. And I'll do my best to respond after those two superb talks. David, I think we need more planners to expound on architects. The outsider's perspective is much appreciated. You interweave a fellow planner's perspective with those of a father's devoted son and friend. Jeff's paper focused on things that matter about Stein and things that matter beyond Stein. And you both have enlightened those who already knew Joseph Allen Stein and those who did not know him, but now know him so well after your two papers. Now, I'm going to try and add a few comments. I believe that Stein was intent on building dialogues as well as building buildings. His dialogues engaged with context, and whether that context was the architectural, the structural, the material, the social, the cultural, or the ecological, and most often the human. Those dialogues began with the building's conception and its making, and then they continued into its afterlives, marked by use, change, and aging. Such diverse, inclusive, and long-lived dialogues, I think, happen with the good architecture Stein always believed was much more important than great architecture. I think that should be emblazoned on the plate in Milstein. Between Two Worlds is the title of the superb exhibition Jeff has curated in the Bibliowitz Gallery next door, and I hope you'll see it before it closes on October the 28th. I think he chose the word between very aptly. Stein's life and work unfolded between the U.S. and India. There also were many other betweens, as we've heard from David. Stein and his family were immigrants, fleeing the U.S. for political reasons and moving, I believe, 17 times between Mexico and Europe before finally settling in India. The between for immigrants, then and sadly still today, is not about sharp divides. This between is the liminal space between places known and unknown, and between spaces of being and becoming. And Joseph Allen Stein seemed to thrive in the liminal spaces between modernism and that very tradition, between machine and handicraft, engineering and architecture, low-rise factories in South Asia's tallest high-rise building in Mumbai, low-cost housing and elite cultural institutions, American coal warriors and Indian socialist planners, Doshi and Bala, and I'd like to hear more about that particular between, and Gandhi and John D. Rockefeller III. From those between spaces, Stein saw not the divides, but he saw possibilities in, along, and among those divides. Now Stein's more than 5,000 drawings, plus letters, publications, and photographs are in the liminal space between the personal archives cared for and maintained so well by the Stein family, David's brother Ethan, David himself, and again his wife Akva, and the institutional archives here at Cornell in rare and manuscripts collection. I hope that the personal, inclusive, contextual, and collaborative that so characterized Stein's life and work will continue to thrive in our institutional setting. Oral histories with the Stein family, as well as his former students and colleagues in India, might well be undertaken jointly with the SEPT archives of modern architecture, planning, and design in India, where an ambitious oral history project is already underway. Creative, pedagogical, and scholarly projects should be supported from students, scholars, and professionals across disciplines and across the world. The descriptions and metadata for the Stein collection should be as inclusive and intersectional as possible so that his archives are not isolated, but form constellations with other archival holdings at Cornell and elsewhere. If digitized and then shared, the Stein archives can be in dialogue with researchers, especially in India, but around the world, despite being physically located here in centrally isolated Ithaca. Archives should be about telling stories, making histories, and inspiring futures. And I strongly believe that the Stein archives will accomplish all three of those goals. As Donna Haraway said in her tongue-twisting proposition, I'm going to try not to mangle this, it matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots, not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. Joseph Allen Stein did that so well, and with his archives here at Cornell, those stories will continue. Thank you very much. So, thank you. Well, should I start, or I know this is such an engaged audience, you may already have questions. I can start, just to prime the pump a bit. I wonder if both David and Jeff, and possibly Akva as well, if you can give us insights into Stein's process of design and building. And I was really struck in the exhibition that the sketches and drawings and even the sun diagrams are all really exquisitely drawn. Now, was his a practice where the architect just drew and expected it to be made? Was he on site, and were there changes made there on site in the building, and were they made in conjunction with the builder and the craftspeople there?
These designs, I think what was important was that they or a process of evolution that took place over months usually, as he would sketch first concepts, revise them, think about them, redo them, change them. It took quite a while to finalize a design, during which, of course, there were many, many conversations with many other people, mostly in the office, of course, but also with clients at home around the dinner table at times. It was not just simply putting down a fixed image in the beginning. It evolved. And I think that was an important aspect of his work, was that it was constantly evolving as he understood it better through this exploration on paper and in words.
So he was kind of like a jazz musician. He was always in the moment, it sounds like.
He was constantly innovating, constantly. And his notebooks are just full of little ideas, catchphrases that would go, one after another, dozens and dozens of them. And there are some of them in the archive which one can enjoy. Hopefully those will be printed up someday and can be enjoyed as well.
So Jeff, your perspective?
Well, I would only add that I think one of the things that was interesting is how the project migrated through the different players in the office and who had the responsibilities, for instance, for being on site. Because the projects were not only in Delhi, but from Lucknow to Hyderabad to Mumbai to Kashmir, there were teams, and the teams often had responsibility for pulling things together. But I think ultimately Joe was looking out to make sure that the project ended up where it needed to go. But my sense was there was a lot of responsibility that was given to people at different levels, from the engineers, the project managers, et cetera, as well in that process.
Anything you might want to add about the craftspeople and the builders on site?
We have we have photographs from the early years, and I think David probably and Ethan have some of the best stories from those years. When the practice was a little smaller, you get a sense of that. And of course, the craftsmen were particularly important on buildings like IIC and Ford, because Joe was trying to integrate some traditional crafts in the creation of the jollies, such as the screens, or in the glazed tile that was set on the sides of the buildings, and even in the adoption of the sort of pentagonal stonework that was from the Lodi tombs. I think as the practice continued and the projects became bigger and maybe more traditional, craft migrated more. My impression is more to finishes and features, and was less integrated in the buildings than they were initially. We can move over there.
I have more questions, but I need to hear from the audience.
I have a question whenever you're ready. Yeah, thank you so much for all three of your talks. As a student of architecture from India and later as a practitioner, Joseph Allen Stein's work has been one of the most important influences for me personally. Having visited most of the buildings you shared today, the adaptation of modern building materials with labor-intense techniques and quality of spaces has really stuck with me. You discussed the destruction of two important historical buildings in the recent past. It is also fascinating to note how important destruction has become important to state as an organ of power today. In this context, I would like to know your thoughts about state-sponsored architectural and urban design projects, architects and their execution in, I would say, fascist India. Some examples would include Sabarmati Riverfront, Jallianwala Bagh reconstruction, Vallabhbhai Patel statue, Kashi Vishwanath corridor, and the new block on Legends, Delhi. Yeah, thanks.
I'm not exactly sure how to respond to that. There was very little of my father's work that was commissioned by the government after his work in Durgapur, Bhilai, and Rourkela. The government stepped away from sponsoring things other than through its own architectural and engineering services. So the focus had to go, at least in my father's case, to things that were sponsored by private corporations or charitable organizations of one sort or another. Other than the Kashmir Conference Center in Srinagar, which was sponsored by the government of Kashmir State. But I think in that sense, the government did not have a strong role to play in architecture as much as it has taken over quite recently with the restructuring of the central axis of New Delhi and the new Parliament building.
I know that Joe has, in his archives, is a collection of the original planning documents for the Lutyens Bungalow District and that area. So he was very interested in what was going on. I think Ensminger asked him about his opinion on projects that Ford was supporting, and I think Ensminger also asked other people what they thought of. Oh, I think that's how he worked. But I don't think he would be, I think it's a very different issue and an unfortunate one, what's going on today in India in terms of, the state assertion of powers like the Central Axis and these other projects. So it's worth a great discussion, but.
I would add that what you are watching in terms of the government's role has been a significant shift in the way in which governments view the mission of rebuilding the country or building a country where a somewhat slanted view of history is being imposed through architecture in modern times, not only in India, but in many other countries as well. Where governments have decided that they are in charge of interpreting history and seeing it reinterpreted through modern construction.
May I just ask a question? So my name's Nima Kudva, and I just want to thank Jeff and David and Mary for such a wonderful presentation. It's, I grew up in Bhilai and Durgapur, part of my childhood. And so I most likely have lived in some of these buildings, right? And it is such and Jeff knows this because we've talked about this before. And I know I grew up actually in one of the houses that Joe designed. And so it's really odd, I think, for some of us to find our lives now becoming a part of history or here, a recognition that other parts of the world matter. So thank you. It's a wonderful thing. And like the earliest person said, Joe Stein's architecture has been so influential to those of us who grew up or studied architecture in India or worked there. But I want to go back to something that you're clearly avoiding talking about, which is the Stein Doshi Bhalla firm. And it's, and it being put together in the way it was, it falling apart. And maybe you don't want to talk about it, and that would be fine as well, but to let us know why you don't want to talk about it, that might be an interesting thing. Because it seems to me that some of those conversations that Jeff is particularly interested in, and David, that you may have lived, the expat in India, what does it mean? And how does that get resolved? And how does that, in the contemporary moment, get so willfully smashed, right? The cosmopolitan India that I grew up in is being erased. Willfully, deliberately, carefully, and it's a long-term project that started even before independence. intellectually, I think, and politically. And so I'm very curious, actually, to either hear your stories on it or why you don't want to talk about it.
I would say that you've raised several points in that rather coherent statement of where issues now lie. When we first moved to India, the government was very much involved in opening up India to modernization and development. Nehru's project of industrializing India made room for a great deal of importing of ideas and sharing experiences. That is much less the case today. There are many, many factors involved. I'm not sure that they actually play out in terms of the relationship of Stein, Doshi, and Bhalla and the formation and ultimate breakup of the firm. There were some personality issues there and some personal behaviors which I think led to the breakup of the firm that are not worth discussing. I certainly don't want to malign anybody in the process, but it was not an easy process to go through because there were some unfortunate events that were part of that. What was important is that when they started, there was a great deal of hope that this would lead to an expansion of the role of modern architecture in India, which has since seen, I think, a divergent pattern. In part, there's this sort of pseudo Hinduization of Indian architecture, which is demonstrated in certain buildings that have been sponsored by the Modi government and its allies. At the same time, there's a great deal of modern construction going up in India with all the growth of commercial and industrial power that you see in the country. India has expanded tremendously. When I was a child in India, nobody ever thought of great wealth as being a mark of an Indian. Today, there are billionaires in India, and many of them. This is quite a change in the environment, which I think means that there's a huge change in the environment in which architecture is also done. It's more and more a demonstration of power rather than of culture and history.
From my interviews and research, I think there are a couple of points on, I agree with David, it's a great question. The first is that Joe explored a lot of partnerships, and sometimes there were multiple partnerships going on at the same time. At the same time as there was SDB, in the early years, he was also trying to create a partnership with two other architects in San Francisco, and later they added some others there. At the end, while SDB was operating, Stein Mani Chofla was also forming and operating and doing other projects and other relationships. So, and Joe himself would sometimes describe different relationships, different partnerships as having kind of different characteristics. The partnership with Gregory Ain was a loose partnership, for instance. When Joe and Doshi started working together, Joe basically invited Doshi to collaborate on things like the plans and even the campus of ICRISAT, which is the Institute for Crop Research in the Semi-Arid Tropics in Hyderabad. And they each did their thing, and they collaborated in that sort of loose partnership model. When they formed the partnership, there was probably a lot of ambition, as David describes, but during the course of it, Stein in the Delhi office designed his projects, and Doshi in the Ahmedabad office designed his projects. And SDB, the firm, also provided most of the engineering for all the projects. So there was still that kind of particular relationship that was not what we might often think of when we think about three partners sitting around a table every morning deciding what they're going to do. And so I think that's part of it. And then I think there were a lot of unfortunate external things that went on and other ambitions having to do with the nature of the industry and some words that I'll toss out like corruption and stuff like that, that also I think poisoned the well.
Thank you.
I'm certainly not an expert on Stein, but, I have studied the history of architectural practice, and partnerships are important. And I think, I'm thinking about, Charles McKim and Stanford White and William Rutherford Mead. We often feel, it has to be so seamless and friction-free. But I would also note that during the years of the Doshi-Bala-Stein partnership, some remarkable buildings resulted, and perhaps at a high cost, in terms of bitterness, controversy, et cetera. But I think we expect it to be unfractious, and it's not. And it reminds me of stories I've heard about Cornell architecture in the 60s and 70s when Colin Rowe and O.M. Ungers were two warring camps. And if you talk to particularly the students and some of the young faculty, they said, oh my God, it was the most exciting time. There were these amazing conversations, whereas it was a very bitter time. And I think you still see some of that played out in the surviving faculty members who were students and acolytes of those two. So, I think we have to be somewhat realistic of what to expect from a partnership.
A subject that was not raised that much is the Joe relationship to design on the land and with the land. Because when I first came and when Joe first came to design, architecture and its surrounding, the circle around the building, let's put it, a very close circle, it was very important part of the design. So for Joe, the design of the land was not so important as the design of the yard. Even if it's a building, it still is a yard. It's not the landscape. But as time goes on, and the whole relationship of our culture to the environment beginning to be understood in much better term, Joe followed it. And that's why he started working with the mountain environment, because he realized that, as he said, that the role of architect is always start with destruction. And that's his word. Few architects think about it, because the first thing you do is you destroy and then you build, but in a different way. And so he realized that there has to be a limit also to how you really destroy, and have to think very carefully whether or not you should destroy. This has had a very personal also relationship, because I came from Berkeley, where the environment movement started in the 60s, and we were all gung-ho on the environment and thought that anybody who design, or saying design with a big D, is a traitor to the landscape architecture, and in any case, he's an architect, so there is no way to relate to them. So when I came to the office of Joe, it was much difficult to look at that one dimension as we look at that as students, because Joe loved the environment, yet he designed the garden. And there was a major difference between that. And he didn't really internalize it till much later in our life as a family. And that was very useful for me to understand myself, the difference between the relationship between nature and culture, between landscape and garden. And so this was in his mind, and it's important to remember when you look at his work, it depends on what time of the design is as to what the land around the building looked like and what he considered to be more important as he got older and understood the scale of work in architecture. Another thing I want to mention just a little bit about the Doshi Bala and Stein is that architecture, as far as Joe is concerned, had nothing to do with money. You do the best you can with the money that you have, and that if you don't get paid, I remember, because we talked about it often, a lot of the satisfaction is because you build it and somebody trusts you to build it. That was not the same with Bala at all. And it happens in a lot of offices in which depends on what role you play as to what is important to you. And as the second generation of the same family get in, it's become extreme on all sides. And that's something to remember. And the same thing in relation to the difference between regional and national, or regional and cultural. Today, when we talk about regional, right away we're thinking about national and cultural values and so-called Hinduism and Muslim and so on and so forth. Joe had nothing to do with it. It was not even in the back of his mind. He was very anti-nationalist on all counts. And as being Israeli, I had quite a lot of problem with that, as you can imagine, because I came from the same time, from the beginning of the State of Israel. But as time goes on, we got to understand the difference. And there is major difference between regional, which is relate to technology and human need, and nationalism, which relates to the ideology. And it's a major difference. And he was on the line of not ideology and non financial gain, but working together to create better human being and better human product.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for so many illuminating insights. I have a question and a suggestion. The question is related to, given especially what was referred to today about the destruction in 2017 of the Rajraval works and Joe's work in Delhi, and given the political realities of India today, and the fact that, as we've just heard, very eloquent comment about architecture as destruction, or beginning with the act of destruction. I'm just wondering about the current condition of Joe Stein's works. I mean, we've seen in Delhi, perhaps at the IIC, or at the India Habitat Center, or at that wonderful art school that David explained. It seems that the condition is relatively good in the sense that it's being used and so on. But I'm wondering about some of these steel towns, Durgapur, where Nima grew up. You briefly mentioned Ben Polk, and in the exhibition you refer to the fact that Ben Polk was designing that other town, Rockwella, or whatever it's called. I can't pronounce it. But I guess I'm just curious about this, and I'm imagining there's a whole variation of conditions around India of these works. And given that, I'd like to hear what that condition is. But given that, my suggestion is, I'm wondering whether there might be a way for Cornell, this college, or the larger entity of Cornell, might provide some funding for architecture students here to document, photographically and otherwise, the works of Joe Stein as they exist today, as a complement to the archives, as something for posterity, given the state of destruction of all kinds of architecture, not just in India. It would seem to me a very fascinating notion to take some of the interest that one of the first questions from a student who is obviously very affected positively by Joe Stein's work, There might be a target of opportunity here for Cornell to take a more proactive role in documenting properly before further destruction occurs of the work of Joe Stein in India. Thank you very much.
Can I just say, Jeff, that's a great comment and suggestion. And perhaps apart from other funding from the university, we have the wonderful Clarence Stein Institute, and it could at least begin seed projects. I think that's a terrific idea. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I agree. To answer, it's a complicated answer too. I mean, because there's deterioration where buildings are in a state of neglect, and there was somewhat the appearance, for instance, of the India Express Tower when I visited in 2008. It's since been worked on. There's been a rehabilitation of the building. But there's also changes that are insidious but really change the character. So for instance, at Lady Irwin College Child Development Center, the building was being upgraded because of damage from an earthquake, and they were trying to be very careful about rebuilding the brick piers and set the precast concrete on top. But the bricks that they were using were common manufactured brick. The brick in the original building was not. It was a handmade brick with a chamfered edge. And so the whole character, subtly, but to me, pervasively, is changing, but yet they were very proud about the fact that they were working on this project and making the building better. So, so I think documenting them and understanding what's happened is really important. And then beyond that, having a conversation about what change means, which is, of course, something we have to deal with in the context of all our preservation. What kind of change works, what kind of change is acceptable, and how do we understand when change degrades, what we're looking at.
I think one important thing to note is the fact that much of the architecture of India that is from before the time of the 20th century was built at the command of royal powers who used the finest materials and for whom cost was never a question. And so it was done in stone, it was done in materials that are essentially permanent. Modern architecture looks at the cost in a very different way. In fact, one of the stories that we tell in our family is the fact that at one point the Ford Foundation put up a modern brick factory outside Delhi where they were going to show how you could make machine-made bricks much faster than the traditional handmade bricks that were being made locally by brick manufacturers. And they asked my father to use some of these machine-made bricks in a housing project that he was designing for USAID. And he came home one day with one of these bricks to show us what it was like. And he picked it up and snapped it with his bare hands. That's the modern brick. There's a real problem with the construction quality that one has to also recognize in what he was doing. That being said, he also developed some new materials which have turned out very well. Some of his factory roofs were made out of bagasse, which is the remnants after pressing sugarcane, mixed with glues and tars that has held up very well over the factory buildings, very lightweight, very inexpensive, and very durable. So a lot of it had to do with finding new materials that would meet the requirements of the time, which you don't necessarily, as I say, see when you have buildings built at royal command with unlimited budgets.
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, that brings us pretty much to the conclusion of our time today. So I want to thank very much David Stein and Mary Woods for joining me, for all of you coming, and I invite you to now enjoy the exhibition if you haven't already next door. So, thank you.